Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 334. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about walled towns, picturesque villages, and Vikings as we go to Yorkshire in northern England.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's show, I do have three news stories for you. In the first one, United made a costly mistake. They advertised first-class airfare to Hong Kong for frequent flyers for just $33 in taxes. It was a computer glitch. The problem is this is going to be the first major test of a Department of Transportation's new consumer protection rules prohibiting airlines from increasing the price after the consumer completes the purchase. So will they have to eat the cost of those fares or not is something that we'll just have to wait and see. Meanwhile, in another United story, more than 200 United passengers are back in the U.S. after a 3-day delay in China and a near mutiny. They were supposed to fly home Wednesday. The flight was canceled because of mechanical reasons, and then the flight was again canceled the next day after a replacement part did not reach China. And then on Friday, they also canceled it because the flight crew ran up against their maximum flight time. At some point, the frustrated and desperate passengers stranded in Shanghai took matters into their own hands, shouting down airline officials and ultimately forming a blockade to get into a Newark-bound plane intended for others. United did eventually come up with a different plane. They might not have been so eager to leave China. They had known about the new controversial plan, a combination theme park, resort, and golf club in southern China in the Guangxi region offered a discount to women who wear miniskirts. The miniskirts have to measure 38 centimeters or less. The stipulation aims to encourage female visitors to showcase their beauty in the summer. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome Elspeth, who's coming to us from the UK and come to talk to us about Yorkshire. Elspeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And when we talk about Yorkshire, we're talking about the area in England around York. But for those of us who may be geographically challenged, could you put that on a map for us?
It's the northeastern part of England, not quite furthest north. It's got a coastline on the northeast coast. It's about 2 hours north of London.
Excellent. And why should we go up to Yorkshire?
Well, I'm biased because I was born and brought up in Yorkshire. I think it's a fantastic place. It's got a very strong regional identity, as a lot of English counties have. You'll probably recognise the Yorkshire Rose as forming part of what then became the Tudor Rose and connected with the Wars of the Roses. It's a very friendly place. Most people comment on that when they visit. And there's a huge variety. It's really got something for everyone. There's a fantastic coastline, there's fantastic inland national parks, there's cities, there's small towns. It's a beautiful place. And it's a very real place. If you go there, York is quite popular with tourists, but further afield, you don't get very many foreign tourists.
And when we say further afield, what kind of itinerary would you recommend? Obviously, if we have a week or two, we're not going to see all of Yorkshire. So what would be the must-see parts?
Well, I suppose I have to put York at the top. Most people would want to go to York because of the medieval history, and I can talk more about that later. I have to give a plug to my hometown, my original hometown, I don't live there now, which is Beverley, which is a smaller but also very ancient town. There is Whitby, which is on the coast, very famous for its abbey. There's another coastal town called Scarborough, which has a fantastic and unique theatre. There's a sea sort of fishing port called Robin Hood's Bay, which is very unusual and worth seeing. The big cities of Leeds and Hull are worth visiting. Hull has a wonderful, wonderful aquarium called the Deep. And then there's also the North York Moors and the North Yorkshire Dales.
Excellent. Now, why don't we slow down and do that a little slower and a little more detail? So you started us with York.
Yeah, so York is famous as a medieval city. It has medieval walls which you can walk round, including a tower that you can climb up in and get a nice view. I think they do guided tours, but you can just walk round on your own. I think if you have mobility difficulties, then you have to be careful which bits you go around. They are medieval walls. They're not all sort of health and safety to modern day standards, but various parts are accessible for most people. There's also a minster, which is a very large, what you'd expect to see as a cathedral, I think, but it's called a minster. Really beautiful church, wonderful stained glass. The stained glass is about the 15th century, but most of the church is older than that. It dates from the 1200s. And you can also go up the tower and get a view of York. And because it's a small and quite old city, I think that's worth doing.
And we say old city, and I'm doing this from memory, but I want to say York was founded by the Danes who invaded England in around the 800s.
Yes, it even predates that, I believe, but it's certainly got Viking history. There's something called the Jorvik Centre, which has one of those experiences where you go around on a little car and they've recreated street scenes. They did recreate the smells as well, but when it first opened, they had to tone it down because people were actually being quite unwell. I think modern-day Brits couldn't cope with these ancient city smells.
No, I would think the smells of open sewers and such might turn off some of the tourists.
I have to say, before the York Tourist Board contacts me, it's not like that today. If you go down the medieval streets there, and they've still got them, the Shambles is the most famous with the half-timbered buildings jutting out into the street, but there are other streets like that too. It's very nice to walk around.
Well, and as a history buff, just in case anyone doesn't know, and I don't even know if we've talked about it on the show, but in the 800s when the Danes came over, that's one of the reasons we have the English that we have today, either your version or mine, is that at the time the people spoke an old German dialect, and the Danes came in and they could kind of understand each other, but they came up with this basically pidgin language that simplified everything, dropped all the male, female, and neuter that Old English had, and then also got rid of the agglutation. English used to we like German, where you put together words like boxcars. And all because the Danes, during the time of Alfred the Great, half conquered England. Didn't completely conquer it and didn't go away. So
No, that's right. And there's still a lot of place names which reveal that area, the influence of Germanic and then Danish and Viking place names coming in.
And how can we recognize the Danish place names? I've heard this, but I don't remember.
I think some of the village names that end with BY. That's
Okay.
an indication. There's a village with the rather curious name of Wetwang. I believe that's a Viking name.
Excellent. And then anything else we should see while we're in York per se?
There's a lot of museums in York. It depends what your interests are. The Railway Museum, it's the National Railway Museum, I think is good fun for children of all ages. But there's a lot of other museums, and I've got a friend who lives there who recommended two that are new to me. One is the Chocolate Museum. York has a history of chocolate manufacture, although now, unfortunately, most of the businesses that were based there have been bought up by multinationals, but it's always been famous for chocolate Rowntrees and Terrys. I don't know if they would be known to all listeners, but English listeners will recognise that. But there's also a place apparently called the Cat Gallery, which has a free York cat trail map. So if you're keen on cats, you can go around and spot buildings which have cats on, and if you've got children doing it, they get a prize at the end.
And why so many buildings with cats on it in York?
I think if you start to look at buildings, you could probably pick a lot of animals and do a similar trail. I suspect it's because it's a cat-themed shop. They obviously thought it would be good to have a cat trail.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then where should we go after York?
Well, as I say, I'm plugging Beverley here. Beverley also has a minster. It's a little bit smaller, I think, than the one in York, but equally historic, and it's not full of tourists. If you go in the summer, you can go up in the roof and see the ancient beams up there. It's not something I've done, but I've seen pictures of it, and I'd like to do it. And at the other end of the town centre, there's another old church called St Mary's. And even if you're getting a bit churched out by this stage, neither of them take a long time to look around if you want a short visit, or you could spend longer. In between the two, there's shops. There's a market, an open-air market on Saturdays, which is not a tourist market. It's to go and buy clothes, fruit and vegetables. But there's also stalls selling coffee and olives and focaccia bread. So it's a mixture of more traditional standard market goods and more recent things. There are some nice restaurants there, and I think most of all, apart from the churches, I would recommend that you visit a pub there. It's known to everyone as Nellie's, but its real name is the White Horse. But if you're asking directions, you need to ask for Nellie's. If you say the White Horse, people will be confused. It has a white horse, a model of a white horse over the entrance, but you'd have to be looking up, and because of the approach to it, you're probably not going to be looking that high up the building. Nellie's is a really old pub. I don't know how old it is, but you go in, you need to look at the floor because it's very uneven. It's quite dark in there. They had gas lighting until very recently. If you go in the winter, they've got open fires, but in some very small rooms. It's just a unique place to go. It apparently has very good beer. I'm not a beer drinker, but it has Sam Smith's beer, which is one of the cheaper beers and apparently one of the better ones as breweries go.
Excellent. Anything else we would see in Beverley, or shall we move on then?
Well, one thing just to mention is if you're coming into Beverley by car, you come over an area called the Westwood, which is a historic area of open land reserved to the freemen of Beverley, who can graze and still do graze their cattle on it. And if you are driving over, you need to watch out for cattle wandering into the road. But if you want to go for a walk, it's a huge area. You can go for a walk, you can play ball games, you can walk a dog, but you also get nice views of the two churches as you're coming over.
Now, you say it's reserved for the freedmen of Beverley. I don't suppose there are a lot of serfs left.
No.
So it's a fairly high percentage of the men are freedmen.
A freeman was a particular role, a particular status, so not everybody had that. And the people, I suppose, who used to be serfs and peasants never acquired that role. So there's a fairly limited number of people who can graze their cattle. My family weren't entitled to do it.
Okay. And that is something we still keep track of.
Yes, if the cattle are still there, that's another reason. When you're walking around there, just watch where you put your feet.
All right. Excellent.
Otherwise, it's 7 years good luck.
Is that what you get? Okay.
Well, that's what we say to make ourselves feel better.
And where are we going after Beverley?
Well, Beverley's about 10 miles from Hull. That's not a big tourist destination, even for English visitors, but it's worth a look if you're in the area. It's the place that has this really wonderful award-winning aquarium called the Deep, which is really beautiful. I mean, I go to aquaria whenever there's one in a city or a town that I'm visiting, but I do strongly recommend that one. And if you can book in advance, they're sometimes open at the weekends. You can eat there. They set up a restaurant inside the aquarium, so you can sort of wander around the fish tanks and then come back and have your next course. And that's a rather nice thing to do.
And that would be seafood we're eating, or?
No, it's a standard menu. I mean,
Okay.
Anywhere near the coast in Yorkshire and Hull is near, you can get very good seafood. But I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat seafood, and I was able to eat there.
Okay.
There's something called the Ferrens Art Gallery, which is a free art gallery. A lot of British cities have very good art galleries. They're very often free, and the Ferrens is, but it's got at least one Canaletto in there. It's got paintings by Frans Hals. It's got a very nice cafe. If you're in Hull, it's a nice place to spend an hour or two.
Excellent. Now, as we talk about this area, before we go on to our next stop here, we're not talking about an area that's so large that we're going to be spending days driving between one of these places that you're mentioning and the other.
I was trying to work out the size of it. It's the largest county in England, but I think by American standards, for sure, that means very little. I tried to get some comparisons. Apparently it might be about the same area as Hawaii, slightly bigger than Connecticut, slightly smaller than New Jersey. So it's about 90 miles, I think, west to east, up to 110, because obviously the borders aren't even, and about 90 miles north to south.
Okay, so not so small that we would just stay in one place as we're going to see this, but not so big that we're going to spend a lot of time trying to get around.
That's right, although you have to factor in the possibility that you'd be on local roads, so they wouldn't be particularly fast roads.
Okay.
If you get stuck behind a caravan or a tractor, you need to be taking your time. But compared to a lot of other counties, I mean, some listeners might be familiar with Cornwall, which is very popular for tourists. It's not the same level of crowds and very small roads that you would get down there. It's reasonable to get about in a few days, but you would be limiting yourself to quite a lot of driving or only seeing a smaller area if you wanted to just stay in one place in terms of accommodation.
Okay. And it does sound like you are recommending that if we want to see, especially some of these smaller towns that you're seeing in a timely fashion, we would rent a car. And
yes, the public transport is quite good for getting from town to town and city to city, either by train or by bus. But if you want more flexibility, I think a car is quite a good option. There are steam trains in various parts, and if you look on the Visit Yorkshire website, they can give you details. There's quite a lot of steam lines, but you wouldn't be using those to do your normal travelling. That would be a nice day out, and you could factor it into your trip to get from A to B if you were wanting to go from A to B anyway, or you could do, of course, a return journey.
excellent. And what would our next stop be?
Well, Whitby is somewhere I would recommend. It's famous for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's famous because it's got a connection with Captain Cook, who, of course, went around the world visiting a lot of places, discovering a lot of places. I guess of more interest perhaps to Australians than Americans, but there's a nice little Captain Cook museum about his early life and subsequent explorations. It's also famous, he's got I think it's a 13th century ruined abbey, but the geography of Whitby, it's a bit hard to describe. It's on the coast, obviously, and there are quite steep cliffs. You can get down to the beach. But between the cliffs, where there's a sort of a ravine that leads out to the sea, which is where Whitby is situated, and the ruined abbey is on one side on one of these cliffs, so it really does look quite dramatic. And it was the setting for at least part of the story in Dracula. So it's quite famous for that, and you do get quite a lot of people who like the Dracula stories coming, a lot of Gothic-looking types, and there are some fairly hokey-looking Dracula-themed shops and museums around.
Interesting. Well, you say that Cook would be more interest to the Australians, but of course the American connection to Cook would be his death in the Hawaiian Islands.
Indeed, yes, absolutely. Well, I'm hoping, I know Americans have an interest in both history and travel, that if they were visiting Whitby, that they would go to the museum there. I would recommend it.
Well, some of us do. Not everyone, I would say, but excellent.
The other thing that is worth mentioning, well, two things, one very briefly, I suppose. It's famous for fish and chips, and perhaps when we come to speak about things to eat and places to eat, I'll mention that. But the other thing is, and I think scuba diving is not really a thing for foreign visitors coming to the UK because you really need a dry suit, and that's quite a big item if you even have one in the first place to bring on an international flight. But if you were scuba diving, the one part of Yorkshire which is not a big place for scuba diving, I have to admit, would be Whitby, because there is some quite good diving along the coast there, including a U-boat that was sunk in the First World War, which is still fairly intact.
So not even a wetsuit, but a dry suit.
I think you have to be pretty hardy to go out in a wetsuit. A few people do in the middle of the summer, but it's pretty hard going.
Excellent. Okay. And whither do we go from here?
Well, I think Scarborough, which is a bit further south from Whitby along the coast. Now, Scarborough has a very nice beach. It's a popular seaside resort and has been for, well, certainly back to Victorian times. It has a castle. It's a nice little town, again, good for fish and chips. It's got an aquarium which is different to the one in Hull. It has some of the same kind of exhibits, but the two things I'd recommend there are they have a seal rescue centre where seals are brought in from offshore when they're struggling, when they've been abandoned by their mothers, and they're rehabilitated there if possible, otherwise they're just kept there. And they do shows, and in the sense you can see them being fed, and the keepers will explain to you about their personalities and whether they're going to be released, and you can just see them swimming around in the big tank there. But they also have penguins there, and of course penguins are always good value.
And you mentioned fish and chips twice here, so let's let's talk about that. I think for a lot of Americans, we think that everywhere in England, the food might be the same. You know, I could get a Cornish pasty everywhere, fish and chips, bangers and mash. But you're implying that this might be a particularly good place, or that might be somewhat regional.
Yes, I think it's true that most regional English or Scottish or Welsh food you can get in most parts of the country. But I think fish and chips, for obvious reasons, the closer you are to the coast, the more likely it is to be good and to be fresh. But there's a famous cafe in Whitby called the Magpie Cafe, which has apparently, being a vegetarian, I don't eat it, but apparently very good fish and chips. But really, anywhere along the coast in Yorkshire, you can get fresh fish, very cheap, very quick, very good food.
And this is, I assume, just the traditional fish and chips that I'm picturing, fish, what we would call French fries, malt vinegar to put on them.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Excellent.
Is this the place to do other sorts of food, or should
let's
I
stop and do food as long as we're talking food, sure.
Okay. Another thing that Yorkshire is famous for is Yorkshire pudding, which, in case there are some listeners who aren't familiar with it, it's not actually a pudding in the sense of dessert. It's made of batter. It's in the shape, I suppose, of a cup, about the size of a fairly small cup normally, and it's traditionally eaten with roast beef. Roast beef and Yorkshire pudding would be a very traditional English meal. You can get it with other kinds of food, and it can be served either as a starter, sometimes with gravy, or even, although you wouldn't normally get this in a restaurant, but you can have it as a pudding with jam. So as a dessert.
As a pudding with jam. I've never seen that. Okay. Interesting.
More something you'd probably get at home rather than eating out.
Okay. And not particularly a vegetarian meal, I would say.
Well, the Yorkshire pudding itself is absolutely fine. I can eat Yorkshire pudding as long as I know, it's not being cooked in the meat fat. But
I thought that was the tradition, that you cooked it in the meat fat.
You can cook it in other things.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, traditionally it was cooked in, as you say, either lard or something that had been pre-meated. Something else I'd recommend from Yorkshire is something called a Yorkshire curd cake or a Yorkshire curd tart, which is, I suppose the nearest would be a cheesecake. But as the name suggests, the curd, it's not smooth and creamy like a cheesecake, although I suppose it is creamy, but it's got that curdy sort of crumbly texture, and it has raisins in, and it's baked. And that's something... Again, you don't see it in restaurants so much, but you could buy it from most bakers.
And I'm surprised with the curd cakes. It's not something that I have seen, really, but somehow I got my hands on recipe book that I think was an Old English recipe book, and the number of pages of curd cakes was quite surprising to someone who'd never seen one.
Well, I've got a very sweet tooth and I like them a lot, but you can't get them here in Nottingham.
Interesting. Okay.
Cheese, I mean, most regions of the British Isles you can get cheeses. Some of the best known from Yorkshire are Wensleydale and Swaledale. You can buy those elsewhere. They're whitish, crumbly cheeses. They've got quite a strong taste, not strong like Stilton, but stronger than the sort of milder cheeses like Leicester cheese or some of the milder cheddars. And you'll get those most places you would go in Yorkshire.
Okay.
And I suppose the final thing to mention in terms of food would be, well, if it counts, it does count as a food, I think, beer. I've already mentioned Sam Smith's Brewery, which you can get their beers in Nellie's in Beverley. And also, for anyone who's in London and worried about paying London prices in pubs, there's a Sam Smith's pub called the Chandos, which is just on the corner of Trafalgar Square. So it's just on the corner of Trafalgar Square, and you can get Sam Smith's beer there. And another Yorkshire beer is called Black Sheep, and you can actually visit their brewery at a place called Masham if you're interested in doing that.
Excellent. And then I think we had at least one or two more stops on your itinerary.
Yes. So we were talking about Scarborough and Whitby, but somewhere else on the coast to visit is Bridlington. Now, that's a much smaller place than either Scarborough or Whitby, much less touristed. I have very happy memories of it because my father kept a small boat there and we used to go sailing along the coast. But it's a nice little town if you're passing by. It also has a connection with David Hockney, the artist. Now, he's just had a big exhibition in London, which was very popular. I went to that and it was great. But most of the paintings on display, most of the ones he's been doing in the last few years, have been in this area between Bridlington on the coast and a small town called Pocklington. And if you look on the internet, there's something called the unofficial Hockney Trail, and that will show you where to drive, where to go to see the areas that he's been painting. So if you're interested in him, that would be a good thing to do.
Excellent.
I just remembered I forgot something about Scarborough that I wanted to mention.
Go right ahead.
Okay. In Scarborough, there is a theatre which is quite famous in this country. I don't suppose it's famous abroad, but it's the home of the playwright Alan Ayckbourn, who has written, I think, more than 50 plays, some of which have been on Broadway in New York. They are very accessible. They're mostly comedies. But the thing about the theatre in Scarborough, it was built by him and for him for his productions. It's in an old cinema, so it's a sort of Art Deco building. It's a very striking building. It's a listed building. And they've built into it two theatres. One, the traditional, what they call a proscenium arch, which is how most of us think of a theatre, with rows of seats and then a stage at the front. But what is really great there is it has theatre in the round, which I know isn't quite unique, but it's unusual. And so the audience sits on all four sides. The stage is in the middle. So they have very clever sets because they have to work it so that no part of the audience feels that the actors have always got their back to them. So the sets are sort of half sets. If they've got a kitchen, you've got the kitchen units, but you can't have windows or walls going above the kitchen units. And the actors are very close to the audience there, so it's a very intimate theatre. The seats aren't particularly expensive, worth booking in advance if you're going in the summer, or if you're going on a Saturday night, or if you're wanting to see an Ayckbourn play, because they do perform other plays there. But it's a really good experience. I think even if you're not a big theatre buff, it's just a great place to go. And they have a very nice restaurant in what used to be the cinema restaurant in the days when cinemas were grand enough to have these things. And that's, again, you would need to book to eat there before the theatre.
And you mentioned if we went in summer, is there a particular season you would recommend we go to Yorkshire?
Well, like the rest of the country, the weather is highly unreliable. If you go in the winter, it will be cold. It's not as cold on the coast as inland. York can be fearsomely cold in the winter by our standards, but you're not talking about it getting below freezing normally at night, maybe a little below in the depths of winter. The difficulty with this country, I'm afraid, and I'm sure most listeners will know this from their own experience or they'll have heard of this, is we don't get a lot of sunshine. And of course, it's always nicer to see places in the sunshine. But as long as you come equipped with a fleece and a waterproof, you could come any time of the year.
There's no bad weather, just inappropriate clothing.
That's right, yes. On the coast, you definitely want to have warm clothes, particularly if you're not used to the coast. If you go on a boat trip, which you can do bird cruises, you can just do sea cruises. There's a very nice bird preserve at a place called Bempton, which is famous for puffins, guillemots, fulmars, all kinds of birds. But if you are going on the beach even, and certainly if you're going on a boat, you might want to be wrapped up. Typical British seaside holidays usually involve a thermos of hot tea and a windbreak behind which you huddle.
And then, is there one particular day of the year that is your favorite in Yorkshire? One particular festival or time to be there?
Well, no, I don't think there is. I think if you get a sunny winter's day or late autumn day walking along the beach at Bridlington, we used to do that with my family, take the dog for a walk. That was just lovely, a lovely way of getting fresh air on a day that wasn't so nice for going out generally. And a lot of the towns there have festivals. Hull has them. I'm sure Leeds, which we haven't mentioned, which is the biggest city, has them. York has a lot. Beverley has them. Literary festivals, various kinds of arts festivals, folk festivals. Any of those would be good to visit.
Okay. And do you have a favorite of the festivals?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, that's not a good question to ask me. I'm not really a festival person, but
All
I know
right.
I'm unusual in that.
And then you mentioned we hadn't said anything about Leeds yet.
Yes, so Leeds is, one of the biggest cities in the United Kingdom. It's a big commercial centre. It's a good place if you want to go shopping. It has the standard shops, but it also has some old Victorian covered shopping areas, which are very beautiful, although you might want to leave your credit card at home if you go into them because they tend to have the more expensive shops. Leeds has the Henry Moore Institute, so if you like sculpture, you can go and visit that. There is a new Barbara Hepworth gallery opening not far away, I think in Wakefield. And I've also been recommended a restaurant in Leeds. I haven't been there. Leeds is a little bit far for me to visit regularly, but I've got friends who live there, and they recommend a restaurant called Create. It's a social enterprise which offers training and creating jobs for people who've been homeless, but apparently the food is absolutely excellent.
And is it traditional fare or is it...
I think they do a variety.
Okay. Excellent. Anything else before we get into that I should ask?
I mean, I've got still lots of things that I want to talk about, but I'm mindful of time. And
Okay. Other regions you want to talk about?
Well, not so much regions, but there's a few other destinations
Okay.
that I haven't mentioned. One is Robin Hood's Bay, which has a similar geography to Whitby, the cliffs with the sort of the ravine leading down to the sea between them. Robin Hood's Bay is very much smaller, and it really is something worth seeing, even if you just go and park up for half a day and walk down into this. It's a tiny place, but it does have accommodation there.
And now you threw me off a little bit with Robin Hood's Bay because you live in Nottingham right now, and Nottingham is not in Yorkshire.
No, and I
Okay.
have to be very careful what I say here because Robin Hood is quite hotly contested.
Is
and of
he?
course,
Okay.
as somebody who lives in Nottingham, I know that this is where Robin Hood came from. However, there are other parts of the country, and certainly parts of Yorkshire, which have a claim to Robin Hood. I think Robin Hood's Bay, there is no claim to Robin Hood. It is simply the name.
Okay. So to the extent that there was or wasn't a Robin Hood, he is probably from Nottingham, but some people would argue from Yorkshire.
He's definitely from Nottingham, but
Okay.
there is an argument that he had some connection to South Yorkshire. There is a Robin Hood airport at Doncaster, which is southern part of Yorkshire, a long way from the coast and from Robin Hood's Bay.
And he did a lot of flying in and out of the Robin Hood airport, is what we believe.
Apparently so,
Okay,
yes.
good to know. And then before I get into some of my questions, do you have any other places that you wanted to talk about?
I think something that's really important to mention is there are a number of ruined abbeys in Yorkshire. I've mentioned the one at Whitby, where really the important thing there, unless you're very interested in Dracula, would be the situation because it is so dramatic. But there's about at least half a dozen abbeys in Yorkshire, all of which are worth visiting, but the most famous is probably Fountains Abbey, which is near-ish to a small town called Ripon. It dates from the 12th century. It was obviously destroyed with the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Well, Henry VIII, I think the dissolution was around 1539. I don't know whether Fountains was that year or the year after because it was an ongoing process. But it's now the largest monastic ruin in the UK, and it's definitely worth visiting. It really gives you a sense of both what it would have been like before it was ruined. There's enough of it still there to give you an idea of that grandeur and size at a time when most people were living in pretty small, humble structures. But also to think about the effect it must have had when the church commissioners came in and destroyed it or ordered its destruction. And as monks were turned out and people who worked there or were cared for there were turned away. I mean, I understand there was a lot of abuses going on in the monasteries, but whatever the rights and wrongs of it, the impact on the area must have been tremendous.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Two areas which I mentioned sort of in the introduction, the Yorkshire Dales, which are the furthest part west of Yorkshire, which is largely in the northeast, but the Yorkshire Dales go quite far west. And if you've seen scenery in programmes set in Yorkshire, you'll very often have seen the Yorkshire Dales. A couple of the things specifically worth mentioning there. It's an area where there's a lot of what's called limestone pavement and limestone structures. So if you're interested in geology or you just want a day out looking at interesting areas, it's worth going for that. But it's also got a connection with the Brontes because they lived in Haworth, and you can go to the parsonage where they were brought up, and that's now a museum.
TV shows set in Yorkshire, for me, being the age that I am, I think of All Creatures Great and Small as one of the...
Yeah, that's set in the Yorkshire Dales.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, is it the Yorkshire Dales or the Yorkshire Moors? No, that's Yorkshire Dales.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I think the more recent ones are probably ones that are particularly of interest to British tourists who would have seen the TV programmes that went along with them.
Excellent.
But I think for a lot of people that live in the south of England, if they've not been to Yorkshire and they think of it, they might think of the Yorkshire Dales.
With Yorkshire, are there things that the guidebooks would recommend that you're not sure why?
Well, for obvious reasons, I don't need, or don't use anyway, guidebooks. But I don't think so, unless what they're saying is, really focus on York. That's the only place to go. It is a wonderful place. Definitely go. If you have one day only to go to Yorkshire, then yes, go to York for that day. That would be great. But I think there's a lot else to see.
Okay. What's going to surprise me about Yorkshire?
Well, I'd like to say the size, because for most people in this country it would be, but I am mindful there's a lot of bigger countries outside the UK who maybe wouldn't be so surprised. I think the variety would be pretty surprising. It's got such a beautiful coastline, but it's got these inland areas. It's got the Yorkshire Dales, also the North York Moors, which are wilder and perhaps something that you might expect to see further north in Scotland. And then it's got big cities like Hull and Leeds, and then the smaller cities, the market towns. It's got a huge amount of history. There's a lot of what we would call stately homes that you can go and visit that have fantastic artwork and history attached. It's got the monastic ruins. It really is a tremendously varied place.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Yorkshire?
I bet I can't find the photograph if I try to find it to give it to you, but I remember seeing a sign and it was written as it would be spoken, not as it should be spelt in English, but it was written as Take Care, Lambs on Road, which is Take Care, Lambs on Road, because there was an area where there were lambs and sheep in the field and a risk of the lambs getting out.
And so a Yorkshire accent out in the fields there can be fairly thick, it sounds like.
It can be. It varies quite a lot because it's such a big county. It's got a sort of a flatter vowel sound in East Yorkshire. In West Yorkshire, which gets closer to Lancashire, it's a different sound again, and then further towards North Yorkshire, you're getting close-ish towards Newcastle and Northumbria, and it starts to sound a bit more like what we'd call Geordie.
Interesting. Any money-saving tips for visiting Yorkshire?
Well, I don't know that there's special money-saving tips for Yorkshire compared to the rest of the UK. In terms of accommodation, look for bed and breakfasts. You can also look for accommodation in pubs, which is now quite popular. The only thing I would say about that is just be careful where the rooms are in relation to the bar and whether it's a pub that does live music.
Sure.
Because you can get caught out having not a lot of sleep. There are two chains of quite inexpensive hotels throughout the UK, Travelodge and Premier Inn, and most of the towns like York, Scarborough, Hull would have those. But bed and breakfast, I think, are normally the best bet. Am I allowed to recommend one in particular?
Absolutely. I would prefer if you did.
There's one called Little Holtby, which is directly off the A1, which is one of the main north-south roads throughout the UK, which passes through Yorkshire. It's quite near to Richmond, which is a nice market town. As you said earlier, I think ideally, if you're going to see a lot of Yorkshire, you'd stay in a few different locations, but I think that would be a good place to stay. It's very beautiful. It's quite an upscale place to stay. There's a lot of period furniture. The buildings are old farmhouses, but date back to, I think, the 17th or 18th century. And I would recommend that. And I probably have to declare an interest because it's run by my mother-in-law.
As long as you declare the interest.
That does mean I have stayed there many times.
And then just one clarification for Americans who may be listening. As you mentioned, Travelodge, that's a different company than the Travelodge in the U.S. that tends to be a much more economy hotel.
I don't know if it's related to the company. It is an economy hotel. You wouldn't stay there for luxury.
Right. But they are two different brands, is my understanding.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. I got 3 questions for you. Before I get to the last 3, do you have anything else that you want to leave us with for someone who is going to Yorkshire?
There's so many things, but no, I think that's fair.
Okay. Picture, if you will, you're standing in the prettiest spot in Yorkshire. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
Does it have to be an absolutely real site, or can I see round corners?
You can answer the question however you prefer.
Okay. Well, I think standing in the Market Square in Beverley, because you can almost see up one way to St Mary's and down the other to the Minster, and you're looking at the ancient market cross and the market around you, and in my case I'm thinking I'm home.
Excellent. Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Yorkshire when what?
Everybody calls you love.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Yorkshire in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Friendly, varied, and beautiful.
Excellent. Elspeth, thanks so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler and talking about your home county of Yorkshire.
Thank you very much, Chris.
In news of the community, I had a comment left this week by Alex on the last episode, Travel to the Island of Java in Indonesia, episode 333 of The Amateur Traveler. I wonder why the person who feels this way about Indonesia bothers to comment about it 10 years after being there. The description of the capital of Indonesia as dirty, filthy, rundown, crowded, just blah, place is a new one for the record. Her attitude exemplified in her statement about wearing whatever she likes, such as shorts and short skirts, regardless of the culture of the country she is visiting, is probably the basis for the term ugly American. Let's hope the listeners know better than acting this way. So I want to talk about half of this, but not the other half. And the part of which I'm not going to talk about is what Lash was wearing. I don't want to criticize her choice, but it wouldn't be my recommendation. But let's talk about the first part. So she actually did have, and if you listen to this episode, she loved Indonesia, and she pitched Indonesia to me. She pitched the island of Java as someplace that people should go. She spent actually a number of months there, more than most tourists do, but she didn't like Jakarta. And I think that the reason I wanted to point out this comment is one of the things about the amateur traveler that we try to do is we try to give you a realistic expectation of what you'll see when you go there. And we tend to skew towards Western or American sort of perspectives. And so how would you react when you go there? We're trying to encourage you to go to places that we understand that not every place is a good match for every traveler. But we also don't want to sugarcoat things. We don't want to say that some place is clean if it's dirty. We don't want to say some place is dirty if it's clean, obviously. But what we're looking for is not what the tourist brochure would say, but we want you when you go there to say, I was prepared for this, I got what I was looking for, and I'm glad I went. That's really what we're looking for. In terms of Jakarta, my first question was, well, is Lash the only one who feels that way? And I'd like to read a paragraph that's a prominent paragraph in the Wiki Travel article on Jakarta. Jakarta's nickname among expats is the Big Durian, and like its fruit namesake, it's a shock at first sight and smell. A sweltering, steaming, heaving mass of some 10 million people packed into a vast urban sprawl. The contrast between the obscene wealth of Indonesia's elite and the appalling poverty of the urban poor is incredible, with tinted window BMWs turning left at the super mall with its Gucci shop into muddy lanes full of begging street urchins and corrugated iron shacks. The city's traffic is in perpetual gridlock, and its polluted air is matched only by the smells of burning garbage and open sewers. And safety is a concern, especially at night. There are few sights to speak of, and most visitors transit through Jakarta as quickly as possible. Now, I say that if you read the rest of this article, they're going to tell you why you should go to Jakarta and some of the wonderful things in Jakarta. So it's not that Jakarta is, again, according to the Wiki Travel article, some place that you should avoid, but there are some things that you should be prepared for, and really that was our intention. Actually, somewhat more controversial, and we didn't talk about it on the show, but after we recorded the interview, Lash had second thoughts that she had mentioned this story where she had nearly been kicked out of the country along with a lot of the other Westerners because of this reaction to something that had happened, and a Muslim group going around to the hotels and taking Westerners, taking Americans, and taking them to the airport to tell them to leave the country. And after she had talked about that story, which she hadn't been planning on talking about it, but came in response to one of my questions, she contacted me afterwards and said, I wonder if we could take that out. It shows Indonesia in a negative light, and I don't really want to do that. And I'm responsible for that one staying in because it's, again, something that I thought you should know. It happened to her. It happened 10 years ago. It probably won't happen to you. But I didn't feel that in good conscience I could remove it without removing some of the information. So, again, you may or may not decide that Java, Indonesia, is someplace you're interested in going after that episode. I personally did find myself more interested in going to Java after listening to Lash, with the understanding that I'd have to be prepared for some things. So I hope others found that as well, and I hope that this approach is something that is working for people. And I do apologize. It does mean we will step on toes from time to time, and honestly, it's not my goal to offend people, but nor will I go out of my way to avoid offending people. If one of the guests has a perspective that people find offensive, I apologize for that, but I hope you understand where we're coming from. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions or comments on this episode or any episode of The Amateur Traveler, please do as Alex did and leave a comment on that episode. If you really agree with the guest, if you terribly disagree with the guest, it doesn't matter either way. Just be polite in how you say things. Or send me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. You can also participate in the Facebook community, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. You can also follow me on Twitter @Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.